The Roman Empire, one of the greatest and most influential civilizations in human history, stood as a colossus astride the Mediterranean world for centuries. Its legions conquered vast territories, its laws and institutions laid the foundations for modern governance, and its culture and art continue to inspire and captivate us to this day. Yet, despite its seemingly invincible might, the Roman Empire was not destined to endure forever. In the end, a complex interplay of factors, from internal strife and economic decline to external threats and the inexorable tides of history, would bring about its downfall. The fall of the Western Roman Empire, in particular, remains one of the most fascinating and consequential events in human history. It marked the end of an era, the death knell of a civilization that had dominated the known world for centuries. But it was not a sudden catastrophe, a single cataclysmic event that brought the empire crashing down overnight. Rather, it was a slow, painful process of decline and disintegration, a centuries-long unraveling that saw the once mighty Roman state gradually succumb to the forces that would ultimately tear it apart. In this video, we will embark on a journey through the final centuries of the Western Roman Empire, tracing the key events, figures, and turning points that shaped its ultimate fate. We will explore the root causes of its decline, from the economic and social pressures that sapped its strength, to the military and political challenges that chipped away at its foundations. We will meet the emperors and generals, the barbarian warlords, and the religious leaders whose actions and decisions would have far-reaching consequences for the future of Europe and the world. But this is not just a story of decline and fall, of a civilization crumbling under the weight of its own contradictions. It is also a story of transformation and renewal, of the birth of a new world from the ashes of the old. For even as the Western Roman Empire breathed its last, the seeds of medieval Europe were being sown, a new civilization that would carry forward the legacy of Rome even as it forged its own unique identity. The fall of Rome was not the end of history, but rather the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Its echoes can still be felt in the languages we speak, the laws we obey, and the very fabric of our cultural and intellectual heritage. By understanding the complex forces that brought about its demise, we can gain a deeper appreciation not only of the past, but also of the present and the future. Join us on this epic journey through the twilight of an empire, as we explore the rich tapestry of events and personalities that shaped one of the most pivotal moments in human history. The seeds of the Western Roman Empire's eventual demise were sown long before the fateful day in 476 AD, when the last emperor was deposed. The first cracks in the seemingly invincible edifice of Roman power appeared nearly 2 centuries earlier, during the tumultuous period known as the Crisis of the 3rd century. This era, spanning roughly from 235 to 284 AD, was marked by a dizzying succession of emperors, military revolts, barbarian invasions, and economic turmoil that brought the empire to the brink of collapse. In the span of just 50 years, no fewer than 26 men claimed the imperial throne, many of them meeting violent ends at the hands of their own soldiers or rivals. One such ill-fated emperor was Valerian, who ascended to the purple in 253 AD. A respected senator and experienced general, Valerian hoped to restore stability to the empire after the chaos of the previous decades. But his reign would be cut tragically short in 260 AD, when he was captured in battle by the Persian king Shapur I, becoming the first Roman emperor to be taken prisoner by a foreign enemy. The story of Valerian's humiliating fate has become the stuff of legend. Some say he was used as a human footstool by the Persian king, forced to kneel and serve as a mounting block whenever Shapur wished to climb onto his horse. Others claim that, after enduring years of such degradation, Valerian was finally flayed alive, his skin stuffed with straw and preserved as a grisly trophy in a Persian temple. Whether these lurid tales are true or not, the impact of Valerian's defeat and capture on Roman morale cannot be overstated. It was a shocking blow to the empire's prestige, a humiliating reminder of its growing vulnerability in the face of external threats. But Valerian's fate was just one symptom of the broader crisis that gripped the empire in the 3rd century. On the frontiers, Roman armies struggled to contain the incursions of barbarian tribes like the Goths and the Franks, who grew bolder and more aggressive with each passing year. In the east, the rising power of the Sassanid Persian Empire posed a constant threat, sapping Roman resources and manpower in a series of costly wars. Within the empire's borders, meanwhile, the strain of constant warfare and political instability took a heavy toll on the economy and social order. Rampant inflation and currency debasement eroded the value of Roman money, while heavy taxation and forced labor drove many small farmers into destitution and debt. In some regions, the traditional bonds of loyalty and citizenship that had held the empire together for centuries began to fray as local elites and regional power brokers asserted their independence from the central government. The crisis of the 3rd century would eventually pass, thanks in large part to the efforts of Emperor Diocletian, who instituted sweeping reforms to stabilize the empire and stave off collapse. But the scars left by this turbulent period would linger for generations, weakening the foundations of Roman power and leaving the empire vulnerable to the challenges that lay ahead. As the Roman Empire emerged from the chaos and turmoil of the 3rd century crisis, a new leader arose who would reshape the very nature of Roman governance: Diocletian. Born to a humble family in the province of Dalmatia, Diocletian rose through the ranks of the military to become one of the most powerful and influential emperors in Roman history. Diocletian's reign, which began in 284 AD, marked a turning point in the history of the empire. Recognizing the inherent instability of a system that relied on a single ruler to govern a vast and diverse realm, Diocletian instituted a series of sweeping reforms that would transform the imperial administration and lay the groundwork for the empire's survival in the centuries to come. At the heart of these reforms was the Tetrarchy, a system of divided rule that saw the empire split into 4 distinct regions, each governed by its own emperor. Under this new arrangement, Diocletian himself ruled the eastern provinces, while his co-emperor Maximian governed the west. Beneath them, 2 junior emperors, known as Caesars, served as their designated successors, ensuring a smooth transition of power in the event of an emperor's death or abdication. The Tetrarchy brought a measure of stability and order to an empire that had been rocked by decades of chaos and civil war. By dividing the burdens of governance and establishing clear lines of succession, Diocletian hoped to prevent the kind of power struggles and military revolts that had plagued the empire in the past. But the Tetrarchy was more than just a political innovation. It also reflected a fundamental shift in the nature of imperial power itself. Under Diocletian, the emperor became an increasingly remote and autocratic figure, a divine ruler whose authority was absolute and unquestioned. The imperial court became a place of rigid hierarchy and elaborate ceremony, with the emperor himself rarely appearing in public and surrounded by an ever-growing bureaucracy of officials and advisors. This new conception of imperial power was reflected in Diocletian's other major reform, the reorganization of the empire's provincial administration. Under his rule, the number of provinces was greatly increased, with each one governed by a complex hierarchy of officials answerable directly to the emperor. This centralization of power helped to strengthen the emperor's control over the far-flung reaches of the empire, but it also created a vast and unwieldy bureaucracy that would become increasingly difficult to manage in the years to come. Despite the many challenges and contradictions of his reign, there is no denying the impact that Diocletian had on the course of Roman history. His reforms helped to stabilize the empire after the chaos of the 3rd century crisis, and his vision of a more centralized and autocratic system of governance would shape the development of the Roman state for generations to come. But even as Diocletian worked to strengthen the foundations of imperial power, new threats were gathering on the horizon. In the coming years, the empire would face an onslaught of barbarian invasions, religious upheavals, and internal strife that would test the limits of even Diocletian's carefully crafted system. The road ahead would be long and difficult, and the ultimate fate of the Roman Empire would hang in the balance. As the 4th century dawned, the Roman Empire found itself once again in the grip of political turmoil and civil war. The Tetrarchy, the system of divided rule established by Diocletian, had begun to unravel as rival emperors and would-be usurpers vied for power. But out of this chaos, a new leader would emerge who would not only reunite the empire under his rule, but also oversee one of the most profound religious transformations in human history. Constantine the Great. Born in the province of Moesia to a family of military elites, Constantine rose to prominence as a skilled general and charismatic leader. In 306 AD, following the death of his father Constantius Chlorus, Constantine was proclaimed emperor by his troops in Britain. But he was not the only claimant to the throne. For the next several years, Constantine would find himself locked in a bitter struggle for supremacy with his rival Maxentius, who controlled Italy and the city of Rome itself. The decisive moment in this struggle came in 312 AD, at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge outside Rome. According to legend, on the eve of the battle, Constantine had a vision of a cross in the sky, along with the words, "In this sign, conquer." Taking this as a divine omen, Constantine ordered his soldiers to paint the symbol of the cross on their shields and march into battle under the protection of the Christian God. Whether the story of Constantine's vision is true or not, there is no denying the impact of his victory at the Milvian Bridge. Maxentius was defeated and drowned in the Tiber River, leaving Constantine as the undisputed master of the Western Empire. But the battle would have consequences that reached far beyond the realm of politics. For Constantine, it marked a turning point in his own spiritual journey and set the stage for one of the most momentous religious transformations in history. In the years that followed, Constantine would become an increasingly vocal supporter of Christianity. In 313 AD, he issued the Edict of Milan, granting official toleration to the once persecuted religion and ending centuries of sporadic persecution. He would go on to convene the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, the first ecumenical council of the Christian Church, which sought to resolve doctrinal disputes and establish a unified creed. Under Constantine's patronage, Christianity would spread rapidly throughout the empire, with churches and basilicas springing up in cities and towns across the Mediterranean world. The emperor himself would play an active role in shaping the new faith, using his political power and personal influence to promote a vision of Christianity that emphasized unity, orthodoxy, and imperial authority. But Constantine's legacy would be a complex and controversial one. While his support for Christianity would help to ensure its survival and eventual triumph, it would also sow the seeds of future conflicts between church and state, as later emperors sought to assert their own control over religious affairs. And while Constantine himself would be celebrated as a saint by the Orthodox Church, his own personal faith and motivations would remain the subject of debate and speculation. As the 4th century gave way to the 5th, the Western Roman Empire found itself facing an existential threat unlike any it had encountered before. For centuries, Rome had maintained an uneasy peace with the barbarian tribes beyond its borders, using a combination of diplomacy, bribery, and military force to keep them at bay. But now, as the Huns swept westward from the steppes of Central Asia, they set in motion a chain reaction of migration and conquest that would shake the very foundations of the Roman world. The first signs of trouble came in 376 AD, when a group of Goths, fleeing the advance of the Huns, arrived at the empire's Danube frontier seeking asylum. In a fateful decision, the Eastern Emperor Valens allowed them to cross the river and settle within imperial territory, hoping to use them as a source of cheap labor and military recruits. But the Romans' mistreatment of the Goths, combined with a lack of promised supplies and land, soon led to open rebellion. The consequences of this rebellion would be felt for generations to come. In 378 AD, at the Battle of Adrianople, a Gothic army led by a chieftain named Fritigern decimated a Roman force led by Emperor Valens himself, who was killed in the fighting. The shock of this defeat reverberated throughout the empire, as Romans began to realize that their once invincible legions were no longer a match for the barbarian hordes. In the decades that followed, the floodgates of invasion burst open. In 406 AD, a massive force of Vandals, Alans, and Suebi crossed the frozen Rhine River and poured into Gaul, leaving a trail of destruction in their wake. The Roman defenses, weakened by years of neglect and internal strife, were powerless to stop them. Within a few short years, the empire had lost control of most of its western provinces as barbarian kingdoms sprang up in Spain, North Africa, and Gaul. But the most devastating blow was yet to come. In 410 AD, the Visigothic king Alaric, who had been raiding Italy for years, finally turned his sights on the city of Rome itself. After a brutal siege, Alaric's forces broke through the city's defenses and poured into the streets, looting and burning as they went. For 3 days, the Eternal City, the heart of the Roman world, was at the mercy of the barbarians. The sack of Rome sent shockwaves throughout the empire and beyond. For centuries, Rome had been seen as the invincible center of the civilized world, a city blessed by the gods and destined to rule forever. Now, it had been humbled by a band of barbarians, its streets running red with blood, and its treasures carried off as plunder. The psychological impact of the sack cannot be overstated. As St. Jerome wrote in the aftermath of the disaster, "If Rome can fall, what can be safe?" The unthinkable had happened, and the Roman world would never be the same again. As the 5th century progressed, the Western Roman Empire slipped deeper into a spiral of decline and disintegration. The once mighty edifice of Roman power, which had stood for centuries as a bulwark of civilization against the forces of chaos and barbarism, was crumbling from within, its foundations eroded by centuries of corruption, neglect, and misrule. At the heart of the empire's decay was a profound crisis of leadership. In the decades following the sack of Rome, the imperial throne became a revolving door of weak and ineffectual rulers, mere puppets of the barbarian warlords who now held the reins of power. Men like Ricimer, a Germanic general who effectively ruled Italy in the 460s and 470s, made and unmade emperors at will, using them as figureheads to lend legitimacy to their own rule. One such emperor was Majorian, who came to power in 457 AD with the backing of Ricimer. A capable and energetic ruler, Majorian sought to restore some semblance of order to the beleaguered empire, launching a series of military campaigns against the Vandals in North Africa and the Visigoths in Gaul. But his efforts were ultimately in vain. In 461 AD, Ricimer turned against him, forcing him to abdicate and later having him executed. Majorian's fate was a stark illustration of the depths to which imperial power had sunk in the West. No longer able to command the loyalty of their own generals, the emperors of the late 5th century were reduced to little more than pawns in the games of barbarian politics. Meanwhile, the empire itself continued to shrink, as province after province fell away from central control. In 476 AD, the last emperor of the West, a young boy named Romulus Augustulus, was deposed by a barbarian general named Odoacer, who declared himself king of Italy. With that, the Western Roman Empire ceased to exist as a political entity. But the fall of Rome was not simply a matter of military conquest or political collapse. It was also a profound cultural and psychological trauma, one that would reverberate throughout the medieval world for centuries to come. For the Romans themselves, the loss of their empire was a source of deep shame and disillusionment. The poet Rutilius Nematianus, writing in the early 5th century, lamented the world's head cut off, and the city that had tamed the world now tamed. The once proud Romans, who had seen themselves as the bearers of civilization and the masters of the world, were reduced to little more than a conquered people, subject to the whims of barbarian kings. But the impact of Rome's fall was felt far beyond the borders of Italy. Throughout Europe, the collapse of Roman power left a vacuum that would be filled by a succession of barbarian kingdoms, each struggling to assert its own authority and legitimacy in a world turned upside down. In the centuries that followed, the memory of Rome would loom large in the European imagination, a symbol of lost glory and a reminder of the fragility of human achievement. The fall of the Western Roman Empire was a turning point in world history, marking the end of one era and the beginning of another. But while the political and military power of Rome may have crumbled, its cultural and intellectual legacy would endure for centuries, shaping the course of European civilization and beyond. In the immediate aftermath of Rome's fall, the world of the Mediterranean was plunged into a period of chaos and uncertainty. The once unified empire was now divided into a patchwork of barbarian kingdoms, each vying for power and legitimacy in the new order. Trade networks were disrupted, cities were abandoned, and the old certainties of the Roman world seemed to have vanished overnight. But even in the midst of this upheaval, the legacy of Rome endured. The barbarian kings who now ruled in the West, from the Ostrogoths in Italy to the Visigoths in Spain, often sought to cloak themselves in the mantle of Roman legitimacy, adopting Roman titles, customs, and laws. The Roman Catholic Church, which had grown in power and influence during the later empire, now emerged as a major force in the medieval world, preserving much of the classical tradition and serving as a bridge between the old world and the new. In the centuries that followed, the memory of Rome would loom large in the European imagination. The great works of Roman literature, from Virgil's Aeneid to Cicero's speeches, would be studied and imitated by generations of scholars and poets. The ruins of Roman cities and monuments would serve as a constant reminder of a lost golden age, inspiring artists and architects to new heights of creativity. But the legacy of Rome was not just a matter of nostalgia or imitation. The ideas and institutions that had been forged in the crucible of the Roman world would have a profound impact on the development of medieval and modern Europe. The Roman concept of law, with its emphasis on written codes and impartial justice, would form the basis of legal systems throughout the continent. The Roman model of government, with its balance of power between executive, legislative, and judicial branches, would influence the development of representative democracy and constitutional rule. Even the languages we speak today bear the mark of Rome's influence. The Romance languages, Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, and Romanian, all trace their roots back to the Latin of the Roman Empire. And Latin itself would remain the language of learning and scholarship throughout the Middle Ages and beyond, a testament to the enduring power of Roman culture. Of course, the legacy of Rome was not always a positive one. The rigid social hierarchies and brutal exploitation that had characterized Roman society would leave their mark too, shaping the development of feudalism and the oppression of peasants and serfs. The Roman ideal of imperial conquest and domination would inspire generations of would-be conquerors, from Charlemagne to Napoleon, leaving a trail of blood and destruction in their wake. But for all its flaws and contradictions, the Roman legacy remains one of the most enduring and influential in human history. The fall of the Western Empire may have marked the end of an era, but it was also the beginning of a new one, a world shaped by the ideas, institutions, and achievements of the civilization that had once ruled the Mediterranean. And as we grapple with the challenges and opportunities of our own time, we would do well to remember the lessons of Rome, both as a cautionary tale and as an inspiration for the future.